The world did not know it was about to burn. In the early 13th century, Central Asia was prosperous, confident, and dangerously arrogant. Trade routes stretched like veins across the land, carrying silk, gold, spices, and ideas between civilizations that believed themselves civilized because they lived behind walls. Cities like Samarkand and Bukhara stood proud, their markets loud with merchants, their mosques filled with scholars who believed history had already chosen its winners. At the center of this world stood the Khwarazmian Empire, vast and wealthy, ruled by Shah Muhammad II, a man convinced that power came from stone fortresses and large armies. To him and his court, the world was stable, the borders were firm, the threats were known. Nothing beyond the horizon seemed capable of shaking them. Far beyond those horizons, the steppe was changing. The grasslands to the east had always produced raiders, nomads who lived and died on horseback, dismissed by empires as temporary storms. But this time, the storm was learning. The Mongol tribes, once divided by blood feuds and survival instincts, were being forged into something unified, disciplined, and terrifyingly efficient. At the center of that transformation was a man shaped not by comfort, but by hunger and betrayal. Temujin's childhood had been a lesson in cruelty. His father was poisoned when Temujin was still young, leaving his family abandoned by their tribe. They starved together, hunted like animals, surviving on roots and scraps. Temujin was captured, enslaved, beaten, and humiliated, learning early that mercy was a weakness the steppe could not afford. Where other men broke, he observed. Where others sought revenge blindly, he learned patience. He understood something empires never did. Loyalty was stronger than gold. Fear was stronger than walls. And speed was deadlier than numbers. When Temujin became Genghis Khan, he did not simply conquer tribes. He erased old identities and replaced them with obedience. Rank was earned, not inherited. Betrayal was answered with annihilation. Discipline replaced chaos. His warriors trained relentlessly, riding for days without rest, communicating across vast distances, fighting not as individuals, but as a single living organism. His army was not the largest in the world, but it was the most adaptable, the most mobile, and the most ruthless. Still, Genghis Khan did not seek war with the West, at least not yet. He sought trade. Caravans began moving from Mongol territory toward the Khwarazmian Empire, carrying silk, furs, horses, and precious stones. They came openly, legally, under protection. To Genghis Khan, commerce was a way to stabilize borders, to test relationships, to avoid unnecessary bloodshed. To Shah Muhammad, it looked like intrusion. The empire had grown rich and complacent. Suspicion had replaced wisdom. When the caravan reached the frontier city of Otra, the governor looked upon the Mongol merchants and saw an opportunity. He accused them of spying. Despite their papers, despite their peaceful intent, the merchants were arrested, tortured for information they did not possess, and finally executed. Their goods were seized, divided like trophies. It was an act of greed disguised as vigilance, and it was the first crack in the empire's foundation. When news reached Genghis Khan, he did not respond with violence. Instead, he chose diplomacy. 3 envoys were sent west, unarmed, carrying a simple demand: punish the governor responsible, return the stolen goods, let peace continue. It was a chance to step back from the edge. Shah Muhammad did not step back. He stepped forward with arrogance. 1 envoy was executed. The others were humiliated, their heads shaved, their dignity stripped before being sent back east as a message. In the Mongol world, envoys were sacred. To kill one was not an insult. It was a declaration of total war. When the envoys returned, Genghis Khan listened without speaking. Witnesses later said there was no rage in his eyes, no shouting, no threats. He simply turned his gaze upward, toward the sky the Mongols believed governed fate itself. In that silence, the decision was made, not just to punish a city, or even an empire, but to erase an insult so completely that no ruler would ever dare repeat it. Orders went out across the steppe. Horses were gathered. Weapons were sharpened. Families were prepared for absence and death. The Mongol army did not march like other armies. It assembled quietly, efficiently, without ceremony. There were no grand speeches, no banners of warning sent ahead. By the time the Khwarazmian Empire realized what was coming, the fire was already moving. The Shah believed himself safe. His empire was vast. His cities were fortified. His armies outnumbered anything the steppe could produce. He underestimated not just Genghis Khan, but the nature of the war about to be unleashed. He believed wars were won by walls and numbers. He did not understand that the Mongols were not coming to conquer cities. They were coming to destroy certainty itself. The first blow did not fall where anyone expected. When the Mongol army finally crossed into Khwarazmian territory, it did not advance as a single force marching toward glory. It shattered itself into multiple columns, disappearing into deserts, mountains, and open plains. To the Khwarazmian generals watching from their fortified cities, this looked like confusion. To the Mongols, it was design. Each division moved independently, yet all followed a single invisible plan, striking places the empire believed unreachable. Otra was the first to learn the cost of arrogance. The city's governor, the man who had ordered the massacre of the merchants, sealed the gates and waited confidently behind thick walls. Otra was strong, well supplied, and protected by a large garrison. He believed the Mongols would tire, that nomads could not sustain a siege. He believed wrong. The Mongols surrounded the city and settled in, cutting supply lines, watching patiently. Weeks turned into months. Inside the walls, food dwindled, morale collapsed, and suspicion grew. When the gates were finally breached, the governor attempted to flee. He was captured alive. What followed was not rage, but calculation. Genghis Khan ordered molten silver poured into the governor's eyes and ears. A punishment designed not only to kill, but to send a message that would travel faster than any army. Otra was sacked. Its people were slaughtered or enslaved. The city that had once bustled with trade became silent ruins. But this was only the beginning, and worse, it was intentional. The Mongols wanted survivors to escape. They wanted fear to move ahead of them. News spread across the empire like a disease. Merchants whispered. Refugees flooded roads. Rumors grew more terrifying with every retelling. Some said the Mongols killed everyone. Others claimed they spared no one but children. Some insisted they were demons, not men. Shah Muhammad dismissed these stories as exaggerations, believing panic was more dangerous than the enemy itself. He made the fatal choice to divide his forces, scattering his armies across cities rather than concentrating them into a single decisive defense. In doing so, he handed the Mongols exactly what they wanted. Bukhara fell next, and it fell quickly. The city's defenders expected a long siege. Instead, Mongol forces appeared seemingly from nowhere. Having crossed desert routes considered impossible, the city gates were breached almost immediately. Genghis Khan entered Bukhara on horseback and rode directly to the mosque. Standing before the terrified population, he spoke calmly, telling them he was the punishment sent for their sins. Then the slaughter began. Soldiers were executed. Civilians were driven from their homes. The city burned, its wealth stripped, and its people reduced to survivors who would carry the story onward. Samarkand, the jewel of the empire, believed itself invincible. Its walls were thick, its army massive, reinforced with war elephants imported from distant lands. Shah Muhammad's commanders prepared for a decisive stand. They never got one. Mongol tactics dismantled the defenders piece by piece. False retreats lured cavalry out of the city. Psychological warfare broke morale. When the Mongols breached the walls, chaos erupted. Soldiers defected. Commanders fled. The elephants panicked and trampled their own lines. Within days, Samarkand fell. Tens of thousands were killed. Skilled artisans were spared, chained, and sent east to serve the Mongol machine. The rest were erased. As city after city collapsed, Shah Muhammad began to run. The ruler of one of the greatest empires on earth abandoned his capital, fleeing west with a small retinue, constantly looking over his shoulder. The Mongols pursued him relentlessly, not to capture him quickly, but to break him psychologically. He was hunted like prey, forced to watch his empire crumble behind him. Each city he passed through closed its gates, fearing association with a doomed king. Power deserted him as fast as loyalty. The Mongol advance did not slow. Entire regions were wiped clean. Irrigation systems were destroyed. Fields were burned. The land itself was punished. This was not conquest for territory. It was annihilation as strategy. Genghis Khan understood that an empire could be killed not just by defeating its armies, but by erasing its ability to recover. The Khwarazmian world was collapsing into ash. By the time Shah Muhammad reached the shores of the Caspian Sea, he was no longer a king, only a fugitive haunted by failure, sick, paranoid, abandoned. He died alone on a small island, his empire already dead before his body was buried. His death did not end the war. It only marked the moment when resistance ceased to matter. The Mongols continued west, hunting remnants, crushing revolts before they could form. Cities that surrendered early were sometimes spared. Those that resisted were made examples. Fear became the Mongols' most powerful weapon. Entire towns opened their gates at the mere rumor of Mongol approach. The world was learning a new rule. Survival depended on obedience. When the invasion finally slowed, the Khwarazmian Empire no longer existed. In its place was silence, ruins, and a scar across Central Asia that would last generations. The Mongols had not just defeated an empire, they had rewritten the meaning of war. And this was only the beginning of what the Mongol war machine would unleash upon the world. The devastation left behind was not accidental. It was deliberate, measured, and horrifyingly efficient. Wherever the Mongols passed, they dismantled not only armies, but the systems that allowed life to return. Canals were smashed, farmland burned, seed stores destroyed. Survivors wandered through landscapes that could no longer feed them. Famine followed slaughter, and disease followed famine. Even places the Mongols never reached directly felt their shadow through hunger and fear. This was war designed to echo long after the horses were gone. The Mongol army did not rely on strength alone. It relied on terror used with precision. Prisoners were forced to march ahead of advancing forces, shouting warnings to cities yet to be attacked. Some were used as human shields. Others were released intentionally, carrying stories so exaggerated that truth no longer mattered. Resistance collapsed before battles even began. Genghis Khan understood human psychology better than most rulers understood geography. He knew that fear traveled faster than armies. Meanwhile, Mongol commanders operated with frightening independence. Sub-generals were trusted to make decisions on the ground, adapting instantly to terrain and enemy behavior. Communication was constant. Riders changing horses at relay stations, messages flying across hundreds of kilometers in days. Khwarazmian commanders, tied to rigid hierarchies and slow messengers, reacted to ghosts, while real armies moved unseen behind them. By the time defenses were prepared, the Mongols were already elsewhere, striking something more vulnerable. In the ruins of once great cities, survivors struggled to understand what had happened. Scholars who had spent lifetimes debating philosophy now begged for food. Children who had never known hunger watched their parents die of thirst beside broken wells. The idea of empire, once comforting, now felt like a lie. Walls had failed, armies had vanished. God, some whispered, had turned away. Others believed this destruction was divine punishment. Meaning itself was collapsing alongside buildings. Genghis Khan did not linger in grief or reflection. To him, destruction was not cruelty but necessity. Resistance had to be made unthinkable. Each annihilated city was a lesson written in blood. He spared artisans, engineers, doctors, and scribes, integrating them into his growing empire. Knowledge was preserved, but populations were erased. The Mongol state grew smarter, even as the world around it grew emptier. As Central Asia burned, the shockwaves traveled outward. Distant rulers heard fragmented reports of entire regions wiped from maps. Some dismissed them as exaggerations. Others began to fortify borders, unaware that traditional defense meant nothing against an enemy that refused to fight wars the expected way. Diplomats were sent. Some returned, some never did. Every decision carried unbearable weight, because no one truly understood what kind of power they were dealing with. The Mongols themselves changed through this war. Victory reinforced their belief that heaven favored them. Discipline tightened. Confidence hardened into inevitability. Soldiers who had once been herders now saw themselves as instruments of destiny. Loyalty to Genghis Khan deepened into something almost religious. He was no longer merely a leader, he was proof that the world could be broken and reshaped. By the end of the Khwarazmian campaign, Central Asia was no longer a crossroads of cultures. It was a graveyard of civilizations. Trade routes shifted. Populations collapsed. Some regions would take centuries to recover, if they recovered at all. The silence left behind was as loud as the battles that caused it. Yet even as the fires cooled, the Mongols did not rest. Scouts pushed further west. Maps expanded. New targets appeared beyond ruined horizons. The destruction of one empire had proven a terrifying truth. No power on Earth was prepared for this kind of war. The world had entered a new age, whether it accepted it or not. What followed the destruction of the Khwarazmian Empire was not peace, but a long, suffocating pause in which the world tried to understand what had just happened. Survivors wandered through ruins where cities once stood, unable to recognize the land they had grown up in. Roads ended abruptly in ash. Rivers flowed past broken bridges and abandoned villages. The idea that an empire could simply vanish in a matter of years felt unreal, like a nightmare that refused to end, even after waking. Fear became the new language of diplomacy. Rulers who had never met the Mongols now made decisions based entirely on rumors. Some prepared for war, Others rushed to submit, sending gifts, hostages, and promises of loyalty eastward. A single Mongol scout spotted on the horizon was enough to empty towns overnight. Resistance no longer depended on strength or courage. It depended on whether fear arrived before hope. The psychological damage ran deeper than physical destruction. Generations grew up surrounded by stories of slaughter, learning that survival depended on obedience and silence. Parents taught children not songs, but warnings. Merchants altered routes to avoid cursed regions. Scholars stopped recording histories, believing nothing could stop the force that had rewritten reality itself. The world had learned that progress could be reversed, that civilization was fragile, and that memory could be erased with fire. Inside the Mongol ranks, the war hardened discipline into doctrine. Commanders refined methods tested in Khwarazmia, perfecting deception, speed, and coordinated terror. Every campaign afterward drew from lessons learned during this invasion. Never allow an enemy to concentrate. Never allow hope to spread. Never allow resistance to become symbolic. The Khwarazmian Empire had not simply been defeated. It had been used as a training ground for global conquest. Genghis Khan himself emerged, changed. He no longer negotiated from a position of uncertainty. He spoke as a man who had already tested the limits of destruction and found no resistance capable of stopping him. To his followers, his survival through constant war confirmed divine favor. To his enemies, his name became a curse spoken in whispers. The man who once sought trade had learned that fear was faster, cheaper, and far more effective, yet even the Mongols could not escape consequence. The land they destroyed no longer fed armies. Regions reduced to wasteland offered nothing to tax, nothing to govern. Mongol strategy adapted again, shifting toward controlled terror rather than total annihilation. The Khwarazmian War had taught them where absolute destruction worked and where it backfired. Empires were meant to be broken, not always erased. Centuries later, historians would argue over numbers. How many died? How many cities vanished? How much was exaggerated by fear, and how much was real? But numbers could never capture the true loss. What disappeared was continuity. Libraries burned. Oral traditions ended with their speakers. Skills passed through generations were interrupted forever. Entire cultural threads snapped, leaving gaps no conquest could repair. The world moved on, because it always does. New empires rose. New cities were built atop old bones. Trade routes reopened, though never quite the same. But something permanent remained beneath the surface. The Khwarazmian invasion had proven that history was not a gradual march forward. It could collapse suddenly, violently, without warning. Even today, echoes remain. Ruins swallowed by sand. Canals that never carried water again. Regions that took hundreds of years to recover population. The Mongols did not just conquer territory. They altered demographic, economic, and psychological landscapes in ways that still shaped Central Asia. And perhaps the most terrifying legacy was this. After Khwarazmia, the world knew what was possible. The illusion of safety was gone. No wall was thick enough. No empire eternal enough. Power, once exposed as temporary, could never be fully trusted again. The war that erased an empire did more than destroy a kingdom. It taught humanity a lesson. It would never unlearn that civilization survives not because it is strong, but because it is lucky. In the years that followed, the memory of the Khwarazmian Empire faded faster than anyone expected. Children grew up among ruins without knowing the names of the cities that once stood there. Maps were redrawn, borders erased and replaced with vague, empty spaces labeled as wastelands. What had been a center of the civilized world became a warning etched into geography itself. Travelers crossed those lands in silence, sensing that history there was not merely past, but buried. The Mongol Empire expanded outward, but it never again needed to prove itself the way it had in Khwarazmia. That campaign had become a legend even among Mongols, a reference point for absolute dominance. When envoys were sent to distant rulers afterward, they carried no threats. They carried stories. Cities surrendered, not because Mongol armies were visible, but because memory had arrived first. The war had weaponized reputation, and reputation required no supply lines. Other empires adjusted, not out of courage, but out of terror. Fortifications were redesigned. Diplomacy changed tone. Some rulers chose submission early, calculating survival over pride. Others prepared for resistance, but avoided direct confrontation, hoping distance might protect them. None of them truly believed they were safe. The Mongols had turned uncertainty into a permanent condition of rule. For historians, the Khwarazmian War became a turning point. Before it, empires believed scale ensured survival. After it, scale became a liability. Large territories meant long borders. slow responses, divided loyalties. The Mongols demonstrated that speed and coordination could collapse complexity. Power was no longer about how much land you controlled, but how quickly you could act. Genghis Khan did not live to see the full extent of his legacy, but he understood its direction. He had broken the illusion of permanence. He had shown that civilization was not a shield, but a structure that could be dismantled piece by piece. His successors would expand further, conquer more territory, rule more people, but none of their victories would feel as shocking as Khwarazmia. That war had been the moment the world realized the rules had changed. For the survivors, life continued in fragments. Some rebuilt small communities. Others migrated, carrying stories westward and southward. Those stories evolved, distorted by fear and time, but always centered on the same idea. Resistance had meant extinction. Over generations, that lesson shaped behavior, discouraging rebellion, encouraging caution. Even when Mongol rule weakened, the memory of what had happened lingered longer than authority. The land itself remembered. Archaeologists centuries later would uncover layers of ash, sudden population drops, abandoned irrigation systems that had once sustained millions. These were not signs of slow decline. They were fingerprints of catastrophe. The Khwarazmian Empire had not decayed. It had been cut out of history in a single motion. And yet, history is never simple. Alongside destruction came unintended connections. Mongol rule reopened trade routes under a single authority. Knowledge moved again between East and West. Technologies spread. Ideas traveled farther than before. The same force that shattered one world stitched another together, unevenly, violently, and without consent. Progress and devastation marched together, inseparable. This contradiction became the final complexity of the war. The Mongols were not merely destroyers, nor were they builders in any moral sense. They were exploiters. They forced change at a speed civilization could not control. Khwarazmia had stood in the way of that acceleration, confident in its stability. Stability had been its greatest weakness. When modern historians judge the war, they struggle with language. Words like genocide, conquest, collapse, feel inadequate. The invasion was not just military, it was existential. It answered a question humanity rarely asks directly. How quickly can everything fall apart? The answer, Khwarazmia showed, was terrifyingly fast. The war that destroyed the Khwarazmian Empire did not end with a treaty, a coronation, or a rebuild. It ended quietly, with absence. Where power once spoke loudly through courts and armies, there was now only space. The Mongols moved on, but the silence they left behind remained, stretching across Central Asia like a scar that refused to heal. This was not the kind of ending history usually records, because there was no victory speech to quote, no surviving ruler to negotiate with, no clear moment where the world returned to normal. What made this war different from most others was not only the scale of violence, but the clarity of its lesson. The Khwarazmian Empire did not fall because it lacked soldiers or wealth. It fell because it misunderstood the nature of power in a changing world. It believed that size guaranteed security, that walls could replace adaptability, and that tradition would protect it from forces it did not respect. By the time it realized its mistake, adaptation was no longer possible. Genghis Khan's greatest weapon was not brutality alone, but coherence. His forces acted as one body across impossible distances. Decisions were fast, authority was clear, and fear was managed like a resource. The Khwarazmians, by contrast, were fragmented, hesitant, divided by internal rivalries, and delayed by bureaucracy. The war exposed a truth that would repeat throughout history. Empires collapse, not when they are weak, but when they are slow. Modern societies often view ancient wars as distant, irrelevant tragedies, sealed safely behind centuries of progress. But the Khwarazmian invasion refuses that comfort. It shows how quickly order can unravel when confidence replaces caution. It reminds us that systems designed for stability can become liabilities when conditions change. The Mongols did not defeat an empire because they were stronger. They defeated it because they were prepared for a world that no longer followed old rules. Even today, the echoes of this war remain embedded in geography, demography, and collective memory. Central Asia's uneven development, its shifting populations, and its lost urban centers all trace lines back to those years of fire and silence. History did not simply move forward after Khwarazmia. It detoured, carrying scars that are still visible beneath the surface. Genghis Khan died believing he had fulfilled heaven's will. Whether history agrees depends on the lens through which we judge him. To some, he was a unifier who connected continents. To others, he was a destroyer who erased worlds. The truth exists uncomfortably between those extremes. He was a product of his time who reshaped time itself, leaving humanity to live with the consequences. The Khwarazmian Empire, once proud and confident, is now remembered mostly for how completely it vanished. Its fall stands as a warning, written not in monuments, but in emptiness. It teaches that civilization is not permanent, that power is conditional, and that survival depends less on strength than on awareness. History does not repeat itself exactly, but it does preserve its lessons. The destruction of Khwarazmia is one of those lessons, waiting quietly for each generation to either study it or dismiss it. The choice, as always, belongs to the living. And somewhere beneath the sand, beneath the ruins of forgotten cities, the memory of that war still waits, reminding the world how close it always is to the edge.